Tunisia, December 1942. The air trembles beneath the desert sun. A column of British Shermans grinds forward across the arid plains near Tebourba, their treads carving deep scars in the sand. The men inside are calm, confident even. They've fought Panzers before. They know what to expect. Then, something moves on the horizon. At first, it looks like a mirage, a dark, angular silhouette shimmering in the heat. But as it grows, the soldiers begin to notice the shape. The turret is too broad, the gun too long. A whisper crackles over the radio. Unidentified German heavy tank, range 1,800 yards. Moments later, a blinding flash erupts from the German line. The lead Sherman vanishes in a geyser of fire and sand. No warning, no smoke trail, just instant annihilation. The crews scramble to return fire, but their shells bounce harmlessly off the enemy's armor, sparks skipping like pebbles across steel. Another flash, another tank erupts. Panic spreads. What the men are facing is unlike anything they've seen before. The Tiger I, Germany's new monster, had arrived. Its 88mm cannon could slice through Allied armor from over a mile away. Its thick, sloped plates laughed off everything the British 6-pounders or American 75mm guns could throw at it. And just like that, the balance of armored warfare tilted. For the first time, Allied tank and anti-tank crews realized a terrifying truth. Survival no longer depended on bravery or training. It depended on getting close enough to hit something that could kill you before you even saw it. By the end of that week, entire anti-tank units had been wiped out, trying to stop a single Tiger. But from that desperation, from that hopelessness, something began to change. A new way of fighting was born, one that required nerves of steel, patience beyond reason, and a willingness to let death come within 50 yards before pulling the trigger. That doctrine, the infamous 50-yard rule, would transform Allied anti-tank warfare forever. Before the Tiger, anti-tank warfare had rules, clear, structured, and dependable. In 1940 and 1941, Allied anti-tank doctrine was built around mobility and range. British then American crews trained to engage German armor from 600 to 1,000 yards. The thinking was simple: hit first, hit fast, and stay alive. Their weapons, the British 2-pounder and later the 6-pounder, the American 37mm and 57mm, were effective enough against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs, but those rules were written in a different war. By late 1942, the Germans had rewritten the script. The Tiger's 88mm gun could pick off tanks from distances that seemed impossible. Its 100mm of frontal armor rendered most Allied rounds useless. For Allied anti-tank gunners, even spotting a Tiger usually meant they were already in its sights. In North Africa, British gun crews learned that lesson the hard way. Reports described engagements where entire batteries fired dozens of rounds at advancing Tigers, only to watch the shells ricochet like stones off granite. The enemy's return fire was merciless, precise, devastating, and instant. The standard British 6-pounder gun, which had served well against lighter German armor, suddenly felt like a relic. Crews that had once prided themselves on accuracy and speed now found themselves praying for luck. Every hit that failed to penetrate chipped away at morale. Every lost comrade deepened the growing sense of futility. Outgunned and overmatched, the Allies turned to desperation, and desperation gave birth to innovation. In early 1943, British anti-tank commanders began experimenting with a radical change in tactics. They realized that engaging Tigers at long range was suicide. The only way to win was to do the unthinkable. Let the Tiger come closer, much closer. 50 yards became the new ideal engagement range. At that distance, even the modest 6-pounder could punch through the Tiger's side armor if the shot hit precisely and if the crew survived long enough to take it. It was madness, but it worked. This doctrine demanded total discipline. Crews had to remain completely still while a 60-ton machine of destruction rolled toward them. Engines roaring, guns traversing, the sound of treads growing louder with every heartbeat. Only when the Tiger's flank filled their sights could they fire. One perfect shot to cripple the beast before it turned its gun. This new approach changed everything. Anti-tank warfare was no longer about mobility or firepower. It became an art of concealment, patience, and psychological endurance. Crews began digging in rather than maneuvering. They built camouflaged nests, covered their guns with branches and dirt, and memorized range markers like snipers. They were no longer hunters in motion. They were traps, waiting for the right moment to spring. Training manuals began to reflect this new reality. Commanders drilled crews in camouflage, fieldcraft, and range estimation. They practiced firing from hidden positions, waiting for their moment to strike from just 50 yards, close enough to smell the Tiger's exhaust. But the psychological cost was immense. Waiting became its own form of torture. The tension before firing, the long, silent moments as the Tiger crept closer, left deep marks on the men. One British sergeant later recalled, "You could feel the earth shaking under your boots. You could hear the tank coming before you saw it. Every instinct screamed to run. Yet they stayed, because there was no other choice." By mid-1943, this close ambush doctrine had spread across British and American forces in North Africa and Italy. Entire units trained to operate in pairs, one gun to bait, the other to kill. Some units even positioned themselves behind destroyed vehicles, using wrecks as both cover and deception. The battlefield had changed from open engagements to deadly games of patience and nerve. The 50-yard rule wasn't bravery. It was controlled terror. And as the war moved to Europe, to Normandy's hedgerows and the forests of the Ardennes, the doctrine evolved again. Crews turned their guns into instruments of precision, not power. But beneath that newfound skill was something darker, the psychological cost of fighting monsters you couldn't run from. And that brings us to the human side of the 50-yard doctrine, the fear, the waiting, and the transformation of ordinary soldiers into cold, precise instruments of survival. To understand what the 50-yard rule truly meant, you have to imagine the silence. A gun crew, 5 men, maybe 6, dug into the earth somewhere in Normandy. The hedgerows rise around them like green walls. Their gun, a 6-pounder, sits under layers of camouflage netting woven with fresh branches. They've been there for hours, maybe days, waiting for the sound. Then it comes, a deep, mechanical growl in the distance. The unmistakable rhythm of overlapping road wheels. The Tiger is coming. Every man knows what that sound means. One mistake, one movement, one reflection of sunlight off a scope, and they're all dead. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy their position from over a mile away. The commander whispers range estimates, 200 yards, 100. The noise grows, louder and louder, until it feels like the air itself is vibrating. The ground trembles under their knees. The smell of diesel and dust fills the pit. 75 yards. The loader grips the shell, hands trembling despite the sweat and dirt. 50 yards. The commander taps the gunner's shoulder. Now. A thunderclap. Smoke, recoil, a brief moment of chaos, and silence again. If they hit the flank, the tiger might stop. If not, they wouldn't have time for a second shot. This was the rhythm of anti-tank warfare by 1944. Not sweeping maneuvers, but silent duels fought at knife-fighting distance. The doctrine that emerged wasn't written in classrooms. It was born from fear, trial, and death. British and American crews began to act less like conventional soldiers and more like hunters, patient, deliberate, almost ritualistic in their preparations. Camouflage became a science. Crews learned to disguise their positions, not just visually, but psychologically, to blend into the rhythms of the landscape. If the grass waved in the wind, so did the branches on their nets. If birds scattered after a shot, they memorized how long it took for them to return, and used that knowledge to judge when to move again. They became masters of invisibility. Urban environments demanded even greater ingenuity. In the ruins of French towns, crews positioned their guns inside buildings, but not facing the windows, where any flash would give them away. They fired through holes knocked in stone walls, through basements, even from beneath collapsed roofs. One British manual advised, "If the enemy cannot see the muzzle, he cannot see you." The waiting, though, was the real enemy. Every moment between sighting a tiger and pulling the trigger was a test of human endurance. Psychiatrists later studied anti-tank crews and described their stress as anticipatory trauma. The men weren't reacting to battle. They were living inside it, minute by minute, heartbeat by heartbeat. Many wrote letters home that hinted at the toll. Most avoided details, but their silences spoke louder than their words. One gunner wrote, "We saw them today. Big ones. Couldn't sleep after." Another simply said, "It's the waiting that kills you." The psychological strain shaped how they fought. Crews developed rituals to control their nerves, tightening and loosening their grips, repeating range commands under their breath, counting seconds to slow their breathing. The best gunners described a trance-like focus, a narrowing of the world until all that existed was the sight picture, the crosshair, and the enemy tank. Combat reports began to read like sniper logs rather than artillery engagements. Target engaged at 45 yards, lower hull, single shot, penetration achieved. They didn't fire in hope anymore. They fired in certainty, or not at all. But the doctrine also bred fatalism. Crews knew their odds. A tiger could fire from beyond visual range. They had to let it close to within a stone's throw. The difference between survival and death was often seconds. Some commanders began deploying sacrificial positions. Exposed guns meant to draw enemy fire, while concealed guns waited to strike from the flanks. It was a grim calculus. One crew dies, so another might kill. And yet, volunteers were never in short supply. For many, taking action, doing something, was better than the paralyzing terror of waiting. In the dense hedgerows of Normandy, the doctrine reached its deadly perfection. Crews dug tunnels through earthen banks, leaving small firing slits disguised with moss and leaves. They planted range markers, fence posts, rocks, pieces of wreckage, every 25 yards. When the tiger passed the final marker, they fired. Sometimes it worked perfectly. Sometimes the tiger spotted them first, and the result was a flash of orange and silence forever. In the Ardennes, American tank destroyer crews adapted the same principles under different terrain. Forests limited visibility to less than 100 yards. They learned to lure tigers into narrow paths using obstacles, fallen logs, broken vehicles, anything to funnel them into the kill zone. Then, hidden under camouflage, they waited. But what broke most men wasn't the fighting, it was the waiting. The sound of that slow, deliberate mechanical growl approaching through fog or trees. The moment when instincts screamed to flee, but orders said wait. Those who survived multiple engagements often displayed what doctors called combat numbness. Emotion faded, humor disappeared. They became quiet, efficient, detached. As one British corporal wrote in his journal, "You stop being afraid after a while. You just start timing your fear." This was what the 50-yard doctrine demanded. Not courage, but control. And in that crucible of fear and precision, the Allies began transforming desperation into deadly efficiency. But even as they perfected the art of killing tigers up close, engineers were racing behind the scenes to make that madness unnecessary, to give those same men the power to fight at range again. That evolution, from 6-pounders and 57-millimeter guns to the fearsome 17-pounder and America's 90-millimeter, would change the battlefield once again and finally turn the tide. By 1943, the 50-yard doctrine had pushed human endurance to its limits. It worked, barely, but it couldn't last. Allied commanders knew that no matter how disciplined or brave an anti-tank crew might be, they were fighting physics. A 57-millimeter shell could only do so much against 8 inches of German steel. The Tiger's 88-millimeter gun could destroy them before they even entered range. Something had to change, and fast. In workshops across Britain and America, engineers were locked in their own kind of war, not of bullets, but of blueprints. In England, the Royal Ordnance Engineers began rethinking everything about the 6-pounder. They needed a gun that could punch through a Tiger's armor frontally, not from 50 yards on the flank, but from hundreds of yards head-on. That gun would become one of the most legendary weapons of the war, the 17-pounder. Its birth wasn't easy. The design was rushed, improvised, and initially hated by the crews who would use it. It was enormous, over twice the weight of the 6-pounder, and couldn't be moved easily by hand. But when the first test shots were fired, everything changed. The 17-pounder's projectile screamed out of the barrel at over 2,900 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could punch clean through a Tiger's frontal plate, a feat no Allied field gun had ever achieved. For the first time, Allied gunners could look through their sights and know they had a chance, even at long range. The new doctrine took shape almost overnight. No more suicidal waiting games at 50 yards. Crews were retrained to engage at 600, even 800 yards, taking advantage of concealment and first-shot precision. Camouflage and discipline remained essential, but the psychological balance shifted. Now it was the Tiger crew who had to wonder where the next shot would come from. British armored doctrine quickly evolved to integrate the new weapon into mobile platforms. The result was the Sherman Firefly, a British modification of the American M4 tank, refitted with the 17-pounder gun. It looked like any other Sherman, but it carried the power to destroy Germany's most feared tanks. To disguise its threat, crews painted the barrel's end in camouflage colors to make it appear shorter, blending it among standard Shermans. This deception would later claim dozens of unsuspecting Tiger crews. When the Firefly entered Normandy in 1944, its effect was immediate and shocking. German tank commanders, once accustomed to invulnerability, now faced sudden, unexplained losses. A Tiger would turn to fire and explode before its shell left the barrel. Survivors later admitted that the long-barreled Sherman became a symbol of dread on the Western Front. But while the British found salvation in the 17-pounder, the Americans followed their own path. In 1943, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was already testing the 90mm M3 gun. Originally designed for anti-aircraft use, it was powerful, heavy, and perfectly suited to take on the Tiger's frontal armor. When fitted to the M36 Jackson tank destroyer and later the Pershing heavy tank, it gave American crews the long-range striking power they had been praying for. Yet raw firepower wasn't the only breakthrough. Ammunition design was quietly evolving in parallel. The introduction of APCR, armor-piercing composite rigid, and HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, shells with tungsten cores, revolutionized Allied gunnery. These rounds could punch through armor that standard steel projectiles simply couldn't touch. With HVAP, even older 76mm guns could threaten Tigers and Panthers, at least from the side. Suddenly, distance became a weapon again. The Allied anti-tank philosophy shifted from ambush survival to aggressive counter-dominance. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. Engagements that once demanded desperate patience could now be fought with precision and confidence. Field reports from 1944 and 1945 began to read differently. Instead of held fire until 50 yards, they said things like, engaged Tiger at 900 yards, first shot penetration. Observed Panther at 1,200 yards. Destroyed after second round. The tone of the battlefield was changing, and the psychological tide turned with it. The Tiger, once a symbol of unstoppable power, was now vulnerable. Its crews, who once advanced with near-arrogant confidence, began to move cautiously, scanning every hedgerow, every ridge, every patch of earth for the flash of an Allied gun. The roles had reversed. Still, it wasn't just about firepower. It was about adaptation. By 1944, Allied forces were combining artillery, air power, and ground tactics with unmatched coordination. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers roamed the skies, armed with rockets and 20mm cannons. A single radio call could summon a storm of fire from above, complementing the precision of ground-based gunnery. The combined arms doctrine that emerged made even the Tiger's heavy armor feel irrelevant. It didn't matter how thick your plating was. You could be outflanked, outgunned, and overwhelmed from the air. The doctrine that began with terrified crews waiting for a Tiger at 50 yards had evolved into a symphony of technology and tactics. From desperation came innovation. From survival came dominance. Yet even as the Allies gained mastery, they never forgot the cost. The early years, those silent duels fought from ditches, basements, and hedgerows, had forged the mindset that made these later victories possible. The discipline, the patience, the refusal to panic, they were the invisible armor that carried through to every new weapon and doctrine. By the final months of 1944, the 50-yard engagements had largely vanished. Allied guns ruled the open fields. Fireflies, M36s, and Pershings prowled ahead of infantry columns, daring the Tigers to show themselves. When they did, the duels that once felt suicidal now ended in seconds. And yet, beneath the triumph, one truth remained. No weapon, no matter how advanced, could erase the human cost. Behind every technical breakthrough was a story of men who'd waited in terror, who'd stared down the impossible and learned to hold their nerve. That was the legacy of the 50-yard doctrine, not just a tactic, but a testament to endurance under fire. The guns had changed. The tactics had evolved. But the courage that built them, that never did. When the war finally turned against Germany, the men who had lived by the 50-yard doctrine began to see their world change. The gun pits that once felt like tombs now stood empty. replaced by mobile tank destroyers and armored columns pushing eastward. For the first time in years, anti-tank crews weren't waiting for death to come to them. They were chasing it down. The change wasn't just technological, it was psychological. Reports from late 1944 show that morale in anti-tank regiments rose dramatically as the new weapons arrived. Crews who once lived in the shadow of tigers now spoke of pride, of control, of vengeance even. One British corporal described firing his first 17-pounder at a panther near Caen. It was like opening a door that had been locked for years. For once, we could hit back and make it count. That sense of power, though, came tempered by memory. Many of the men who survived the early months of 1943 and 1944 carried with them something invisible, the lingering echoes of fear that no victory could erase. Medical officers noticed that even as combat success rose, anxiety, insomnia, and emotional detachment persisted among veteran gunners. These men had learned not just how to fight, but how to endure the unbearable. Some couldn't return to civilian life easily. Letters home after the war often spoke not of triumph, but of exhaustion. A few lines from a Canadian anti-tank gunner written in 1945 capture it best. "We won, but I still wake to the sound of engines. Every time I hear a truck, I look for a tiger." These men had spent months watching, waiting, and killing at distances close enough to see the whites of their enemies' eyes through the periscope. Even when the threat diminished, their bodies remained tuned to that moment, the instant between seeing and firing, life and death. Yet their suffering left behind something more than trauma. It built the foundation of modern armored warfare. The 50-yard doctrine, born from desperation, became a case study in adaptive combat thinking. It proved that courage and creativity could compensate, at least temporarily, for technological inferiority. It showed the necessity of discipline, stealth, and coordination, long before those became doctrines on paper. In every modern ambush drill, in every anti-armor training manual, traces of those early lessons remain. Even today, military historians describe the 50-yard fights of North Africa, Italy, and Normandy as the most dangerous kind of courage, a mixture of patience and fatalism unique to that era. They were men who had no illusions of survival, yet stayed in place, breath held, finger on the trigger, until the moment of truth. It wasn't just war. It was endurance distilled to its purest form. As the 17-pounders, 90-millimeter guns, and HVAP rounds changed the battlefield, the doctrine evolved from survival to dominance. By 1945, the Allies had not only matched German armor, they had surpassed it. The Tiger II, a monstrous king tiger, could still terrify with its sheer presence, but the spell had been broken. The Allies no longer froze when they heard its engine. They prepared to engage. The lessons from those years would echo into the Cold War. The concept of combining stealth, mobility, and superior firepower became the foundation of NATO's anti-armor strategy. The modern tank destroyer, the guided missile, and the emphasis on integrated support fire, all of it traced its lineage back to those quiet, nerve-wracking moments in Tunisia and Normandy. But beyond the steel and gunpowder, something deeper endured, a respect for the men who faced impossible odds with nothing but discipline and resolve. In museums across Britain, Canada, and the United States, 6-pounders and 17-pounders still stand silent, their barrels pitted with rust, their paint faded. Visitors pass by them, often unaware that these guns once waited in ditches and barns, their crews whispering final prayers. As tigers approached, each dent and scar on their surface tells a story, not of glory, but of survival bought second by second. Those guns, crude and underpowered by modern standards, once defined the thin line between annihilation and resistance. They symbolize not just the evolution of weaponry, but the resilience of the human spirit under fire. The war would end, the tigers would burn, and the great armored beasts would become museum pieces. But the men who fought them, those who learned to wait until 50 yards, carried something eternal. They'd prove that even when technology fails, resolve does not. That even in hopeless situations, precision and patience can turn desperation into dominance. And that's what the 50-yard doctrine really was. A story not about weapons, but about willpower. It wasn't the thickness of armor or the caliber of a shell that won the day. It was the discipline to hold one's fire until the perfect moment, the courage to face terror head-on, and the quiet understanding that bravery sometimes means standing still. When historians look back at the Second World War, they often measure victory in tonnage, range, or firepower. But for the anti-tank crews of 1942 to 1945, victory was measured in seconds, the few heartbeats between sighting and survival. They didn't just fight a war, they changed how wars would be fought. As the decades passed, the guns were replaced by missiles, the hedgerows by deserts, and the tigers by modern armor. But the principle remained timeless: the calm before the shot, the patience before the strike, the art of waiting, and then acting with deadly precision. In the silence that follows every battle, the echoes of those 50-yard engagements still linger. You can almost hear the command whispered across time, not shouted, but spoken like a vow. Hold your fire. Wait, now. Because in that moment, the heartbeat between fear and action, the ordinary became extraordinary. And history remembers not just the guns, but the men who refused to break. They called it suicide, but it became legend. The 50-yard doctrine, where courage met calculation and the impossible became inevitable. If you found this story worth remembering, share it, so others never forget the men who turned fear into precision, and precision into victory. Because sometimes, history's greatest weapons weren't forged from steel. They were forged from nerve.